just going to have you say your name one more time.
I'm Farhad Daftary, the director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. The Ismailis, as you know, did actually produce during the various periods of their history very rich the literature, which for the most part was not available to the outsiders. And as a result, the outsiders actually resorted to their own imagination or often fabricated evidence about the Ismailis. And this is why all sorts of legends and myths were fabricated and put into the circulation about Ismaili teachings and practices, and which led to the misrepresentations of the Ismailis over the centuries. But that situation has now changed in the last few decades because of the availability of the recovery and study of a large number of Ismaili texts, and which really laid the ground for the modern progress in the field of Ismaili studies, and a completely new image has now actually emerged of the history and the teachings of the Ismailis. Now, going back to the earlier times, the Ismailis were, of course, one of the most important Shia Muslim communities, but they also represented the most revolutionary wing of Shiism. They did organize a revolutionary movement against the Abbasids, the Sunni rulers of the time, because the Ismailis, like all other Shia communities, believed that the Abbasids, like the Umayyads before them, had usurped the rights of Ali, the Prophet's first cousin and son-in-law, and his sort of descendants, the Ali's, to the rulership, to the leadership of the Muslim Ummah. So that was really the religio-political message of the Ismaili revolution, was to uproot the Abbasids and to install the Ismaili Imam to the Caliphate. And this actually happened in the year 909 when the Fatimid state was formed, a state that very soon led to a major empire. In the course of the 10th century, gradually a black legend actually emerged, which portrayed the Ismailis as a group that aimed to destroy Islam from within, and they also aimed to refute the Alid genealogy of the Fatimid Imams. Now, these polemical tracts circulated widely and soon were accepted as accurate descriptions of Ismaili teachings and the practices. And a second group of the sources produced in the West were really penned by the Crusaders and their Western observers, who they arrived in the Holy Land in the Near East in the year 1099 and soon seized the city of Jerusalem, their main target. They stayed amongst the Muslims for 200 years, but proximity to Muslims did not really improve their knowledge of Islam and its internal divisions. And it was under such circumstances that the Crusaders themselves began to fantasize about the secret practices of the Ismailis. And this led to the creation of a whole genre of myths known as the assassin legends. We find sort of elements of one of these stories which held that the Ismailis of Syria, the Nizari Ismailis of Syria, or the Fedais who used hashish to be motivated, is in this Jewish rabbi's travelogue, the Benjamin of Tudela, who passed through Syria at the time, and he refers to the Ismailis with the term Hashishin or Hashishim, supposedly because they were accused of using hashish, which was not the case because in the contemporary anti-Ismaili Muslim sources, we do not find any statement confirming that they use hashish or the reasons for it. Now, this is, for instance, the earliest, I would say, independent book written on the Ismailis by a French author, published in 1603. It's a very rare book. It's a small book, but extremely important in terms of the history of Ismaili studies. It says, a tract on the origins of the ancient assassins who were the dragger carriers, written by a French courtier by the name of Denis Dubaty. Here, the author fantasizes, repeats some of the then known stories about the Nizari Ismailis, none of which is really rooted in reality. This is just fanciful tales. The Orientalists of the 19th century, starting with Sylvester Sapsi, who died in 1838, and he was the dean of the European Orientalists, they started their more scientific study of Islam and its internal divisions on the basis of Muslim manuscripts. And Dosasi, who had a lifelong interest in the Druzes and the religion, as background material, he really collected all the information available in those Muslim sources about the early Ismailis and the Fatimids, so on. So he wrote a very long introduction to this, which was in fact his last publication, his major work on the religion of the Druzes. Here he reiterates the black legend of the Sunni polemicists about the Ismailis. And in the same vein, this Joseph von Hammer, who was an Austrian diplomat Orientalist, is really credited with having produced the first independent book on the Nizari Ismailis of the Alamut period. But he too, like Dosasi, unwittingly, or perhaps wittingly, lent his seal of approval to the two categories of sources that was then available to the European Orientalists: the black legend of the Sunni polemicists and the assassin legends of the Crusaders and the Western sources. The Ismailis, as you know, did actually produce during the various periods of their history very rich literature, which for the most part was not available to the outsiders. And the Ismailis until recent times were studied and judged on the basis of evidence collected or often fabricated by their enemies, but it was from 1930s and 40s onwards that because of access of modern scholars to genuine Ismaili texts, the record really has been speaking for itself, and a new image has now emerged regarding the actual history and teachings and practices of the Ismailis. And they all point to the rich intellectual and the diversity and rich intellectual and literary traditions of the Ismailis of different periods. You see amazing pieces of scholarship, sort of metaphysical works dealing with cosmology. Here, for instance, we have a divan of poetry from the Alamut period. This is a major text known as Half Bab, or 7 chapters from the Alamut period, which talks about the spiritual declaration of the Qiyamah that was announced at Alamut in 1164. Things really did not improve much until the 1930s, when the modern progress in the field began on the basis of the recovery and study of a very large number of genuine Ismaili textual resources. And this work was pioneered by the Russian scholar Vladimir Ivanov, who had left his native Russia following the October Revolution. He settled down in India, where he was commissioned by Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah, Aga Khan Centre, to formally study the history and to the literary heritage and thought of the Ismailis. And later on, Ivanov, under the patronage of the third Aga Khan, founded the Ismaili Society in Bombay with its library of manuscripts. And it was during this period, 1930s and 40s, that modern scholarship in the field really took off. And increasingly, a large number of Ismaili texts came to be edited, published, translated, studied, laying the ground for further progress in the field. And that made it possible, for instance, for a scholar like Marshall Hodgson to publish in 1955 the first scholarly book on the Nizari Ismailis of the Alamut period, which now replaced the Orientalist text of Joseph von Hammer that was published originally in German in 1818 and was nothing but a reiteration of the black legend of the Sunni polemicists and the so-called assassin legends of the Crusaders and the Occidental sources. And the progress in the field has proceeded at an astonishing rate, and a leading role in that whole domain is now played by the Institute of Ismaili Studies that was founded in 1977 by His Highness the President Aga Khan. And the Institute, through its own research and publications, as well as making its textual manuscript resources available to scholars worldwide, is and has been and is playing a leading role in the field of Ismaili studies and is regarded as the point of reference. So had it not been for the existence of this type of literature and its recovery and study in modern times, these tales would not have been replaced by actual reliable accounts of Ismaili history and teaching. So it's really the literary record of the community itself that has spoken and has really made it possible for modern scholars to replace fiction by fact and to have an accurate description of what the Ismailis really were all about, what sort of history they lived, and what sort of intellectual and literary contributions they made to Islamic thought and culture.